Alrighty, let me get Slack up here on my phone. Alright. Nope, that's Vancouver. Calgary. There we go. Morning, Calgary. The half dozen of you that are here. So hopefully you had fun with Chrome yesterday. Today we're talking about, well, I mean, the label for it is nested resources, but really I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into how, like, the whole router piece and kind of the life cycle of a request in Rails, just so that you guys have a good understanding of what's going on behind the scenes, and I'll get rid of some of the magic of it so that you feel a little bit more confident about what's going on behind that curtain that is Rails. Let's start off. We're going to have Calgary give us a noun this morning, preferably a polite one. Preferably. Yeah. I only drink 1 cup of coffee a day. It feels that way. Watermelon. Watermelon is the noun of the day. All right. Oh. So I'm gonna do an app called Fruit. That way I can actually go into it and generate a watermelon. Hopefully this will install this time. Oh, really? One moment. Oh, libxml2. Loop. Seems like this happened yesterday when I was doing Mongo stuff with the junior cohort. They had just done a new version of the Mongo driver. And so I get in and I go start trying to run stuff and just nothing works. And it's because they had changed part of the API for how you run a query. It's like, oh, While that's doing its thing, I will start off with just a few quick notes. One of the reasons I want to focus on the router so much today is because we have this lovely acronym that we talk about a lot. And, but the problem is that's not even the right order for it. Technically, that's the order that things get executed in. The controller gets the request first. Controller requests data from the model, pushes data from the model into the view. Cool. But even that's not accurate because we have that. So the router is actually the first thing that gets triggered in Rails, because the router is the component of Rails that is actually listening for the incoming request. Morning, Ben. Hold on, let me just look at the time. Okay, yeah. So the router gets the request first, and see, Benji's the only one who said he was going to be late, so he gets free pass. Everybody else called out. For Calgary's benefit, Eric is currently shaming Ben quite thoroughly, better than I could have. So yeah, router gets the request first, and the router is what decides which controller is going to handle the request. That's important. In fact, that's critical because that's where your debugging starts. Also, and I'm sure Crum talked about this yesterday. I haven't watched his lecture, but the thing is, when you are learning a new piece of software, tell Joel you're sorry. Hey Trey, tell Joel you're sorry. When you're learning a new piece of software, especially a big framework like Rails, you can't just open up the files and start reading all the files top to bottom, left to right, alphabetical order. Like, that's not going to teach you anything about the framework or how it works. You have to trace the path of execution. How does that if it's a web framework, great. How does it handle a request? If it's something like software that is existing just in a web page and it's event driven, okay, we'll start with the event itself. When I click on this button, then what code gets run? So in this case, we start with the router. I'm going to start with any route that's going to go into my application, and then I'm going to follow that route through to be able to understand the code that gets touched. And so that's why I have to start at the router, because the router is going to listen for that unique combination of verb and path. The router is what is going to set up my params. The router is what is going to initialize my session. The router is going to handle the cookies. And then it's going to hand all that information off to the controller. And when it hands it off to the controller, then there's going to be a method, the action method that we have in there that is specifically tasked with making that request be fulfilled. Rails is a resource-based framework. It's not just for generating web pages. Just as easily, we could be getting a request for a PDF file or an email or a JSON or anything else. So the controller has to decide how to satisfy that resource. And that almost always means pulling data from a model. So that's the next step. The controller is going to run the query from the model to get the data it needs. And then once it has that, it's going to push that to the view. And then the view goes through the whole process of not only rendering the view, but rendering the layout, which then becomes the response that gets sent back to the client. So it's important to understand that that's the order. We just don't say RCMV because for some reason that doesn't roll off the tongue quite as nicely. I don't know why. So that's why I like to start with that. And that was installed. Good. So let's try this one more time now that the other one is done. Oh, look, now it works. Haha. All right. So I'm going to scaffold a watermelon. And we're going to give this one a name, which is a string, a shape, which is a string, and a weight, which is an integer. And when I scaffold, this is going to give me all the everythings. This is going to give me the model, the view, the controller, and the routes. It's also going to give me a migration, which is quite nice. So there's all the stuff it gave me. And one of the things we're going to see specifically that happened is that it invoked this resource route method, and it added to my route resources watermelons. So first things first, I'm going to run my rakedb migrate. There we go. And then I'm going to run rake routes, which I have to zoom down to there, unfortunately, to have it be legible, which kind of sucks. And it's because these things are in here, and I hate these things, and I don't know how to make them go away. But these are the ones that we want to focus on right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these out, and put them in here where it's still hard to see them. Really? Wow. Let's do this. Now for the magic of regular expressions. Too far. Also too far. Try this. Yeah, it's a little bit better. It at least gets it to where we can kind of read it. Okay. And now I can do this, and you can actually see it. So these are our routes. These are our RESTful routes, or Rails RESTful routes anyway. And these are the ones that give us access to all of our CRUD functions. Morning. There's a theme going here. Hey, Eric, where's he live? Sorry, okay. Yeah, Surrey's, yeah. Oh, it's Friday. Man, it's Friday. So everyone's job is to check their bedroom window tonight and see if Eric is like. Spider-Man. Back on topic. So the thing is, at the risk of getting terribly philosophical, when we are looking at our routes here, what we are looking at is a representation of the data that we're going to be accessing. Because the routes here, these are the resources that we want. These are the ones that are given to us by that configuration in the routes file. Big routes.rb literally just says resources watermelons. So that's what was configured for us when we scaffolded. Makes perfect sense. That's a resource that we would request from our fruit app. Thank you, Dave. So this represents our data. This represents our ability to interact with our data. But it's very rare for you to have an application that just has a single resource. So we're going to go one step further. And I'm going to scaffold seeds. And we'll name them just so that I can have a field. References watermelon. And because the seeds are, of course, going to have to belong to a watermelon. And we'll give them color. Sure, why not? And I'm just going to double check on that migration. Because I thought I did that in the wrong order, and I did. So I had to fix it. Okay, so now I have a seeds table, and it has a watermelon ID. That's awesome. And there's Spencer. Morning. Oh, that's okay. You're not the first. I wish I could say that you were the only one. All right. And as much as I hate to do this, I need to run rake routes again. There we go. So what we can see is we've got the same set of routes for our seeds and our watermelons, which is great because, as we've already established, this is how we access that data. But one of the things we did when we created our seeds is we identified, okay, she's off the hook, she's staff. Oh, it's been a morning for people coming in late. If anything, she's actually early. There's a lesson there. Be like Megan. Yeah, what we don't have here is the representation of the relationship that we created in our schema. Our seeds and our watermelon have a relationship to each other. But we can't see that in our routes. We should be able to see that in our routes because we should be able to look at these RESTful routes and see the representation of the state of data that's going to be transferred. So what I don't have in a case like this is I don't have a route that looks something like watermelons 57 seeds, because that would be the seeds connected to watermelon number 57. I can't see that at all. In fact, if I wanted to figure that out with the routes that I have right now here, I'd have to literally go through my list of seeds and seed by seed build a new list of ones that were assigned to watermelon number 57, and that would suck. So I want to be able to go in and get that configured. And typically, most people start with just this. And this is what we would call a nested resource, where seeds is now nested inside of the routes for watermelons. And if we take a look at what that's going to do to our routes, we see we have all of our watermelon routes that we had before. For Calgary's benefit, that's all of these. And then we have this new set of routes that are up here that are specifically watermelon / watermelon ID / seeds. Things I never expected to be saying on Friday morning. Good choice of nouns. So yeah, now I can see that relationship to the data. And in a lot of cases, this makes perfect sense. But there's something here that makes me scratch my head and say, And that has to do with all of the contexts that I have given to accessing my seeds in the context of watermelons. Because that's the other thing. While these routes are, they represent how I access my resources, how I work with my data, this is also the context of my data. So if seeds is under the routes for watermelons, that's a context. Benji, you are totally in the clear. You messaged. Yeah, there's a context here that's being implied for how those seeds work in the context of watermelons, and that makes sense. Some of these make sense. So here's the thing that we would have to think about. If I was deleting a seed from my database, does it matter which watermelon it's associated with? No. If I'm just deleting a seed, I'm deleting the seed. My context of deleting that seed doesn't change because it's associated with a watermelon. Similarly, if I wanted to just view a single seed, do I need to know, like, do I need to access that in the context of a watermelon to be able to do that? No. But, for example, if I want to create a new seed, I would definitely want that to be in the context of a watermelon because seeds belong to watermelons. So there are times when this context makes sense, and there are times when it doesn't. So the cool thing is Rails gives us the ability to modify this. We can modify our routes with only and except filters. So only means only these routes, and except means not these routes, or not these actions, rather. So I can say only new create, because those make sense for that context to be there. Let's see, index definitely makes sense, because I would want to list all the seeds, but only in association with a watermelon. Listing all the seeds I possibly have, I lose the context of the seed at that point. So new, create, and index, that makes sense for me to have those there. But if I limit it to only these three things, what I lose at this point is any routes that allow me to edit, update, delete. Those are gone, or show. So what I would do in this case is I would come outside of my nested resource, and I would list seeds again as a top-level resource. And I would just invert it. So when I do that, I get this. So index, created, new are up there in the context of the watermelon. And that makes sense. That context makes sense. I want to see all the seeds associated with a watermelon. I want to create a seed associated with a watermelon. I want to, get the form to create a new seed. But if I just want to see the seeds by themselves, like edit, show, update, and destroy, those are down there. They have their own context. They stand alone at that point. The context of accessing that data is by itself. So with the only and the except modifiers, it's a really cool way for me to be able to modify the context that I'm able to access this data. But this is Rails. And there's an interesting rule of working with Rails that has always proven true, which is as soon as you're doing something with Rails and it seems like you're having to do a lot of work to make it happen, you're probably doing it the wrong way. And that's a lot of typing. So here's what Rails gives us. Rails gives us shallow true. And with shallow true, I'm telling it to do the same thing I just did. And that's way easier to type. And now, when I run rake routes, look what I've got. Exactly the same thing I had before. It's put them in a slightly different order so that my seeds routes are up here now, as opposed to at the bottom, but shallow decides what does and does not need context. And the idea of shallowly nested routes is a concept that's been around for a long time because of how humans work with data. So when we have related data, we tend to want this particular context for accessing it. This is the context that makes the most sense. If you think about blog posts, for instance. So there'd be users and there'd be posts. So if I wanted to see all the posts for a user, I would go to, whatever blogpost.com/user/ID/posts. That would be the index. And if that user was creating a new post, they'd go to like their account, new post, which would go to like /post/new after their user URL. They'd post it to user/user/ID/posts. Like that's where that form would post to, and it would create a new one. But if I was reading an individual post, the context of the user that wrote it now doesn't matter. It would just be /post/ID. So this is a very common context that we access data in, and it has obtained the term shallow nesting. And because this is so common, and because Rails wants to help you follow convention over configuration, instead of making you do all of that configuration, it just gives you shallow nesting, which is nice. The nice part is, though, we also know now that, morning B, morning Hillary, that if you need to, you can use only and except to be able to limit the context of any one of your resources. Because sometimes you may want to prevent everybody, like all the regular users, from being able to delete something. So you would do a resources whatever except delete. And then that route doesn't get created for them. It doesn't even exist as an option. It's not even like an admin thing. It's just, at that point, it's just gone. So you could limit the CRUD potential and the context potential for a resource using only and except. Cool. Yeah. After you use shallow, can you mix it with only and except? That's a good question. Let's find out. I've never tried this before. Let's say only index. Oh, yeah, that works. When in doubt, try it and see what explodes. So that's nested resources. Now the thing is, with nested resources, you can go as deep as you want. Since this is my fruit app, let's say that I had resources bananas, which are dying, by the way. If you like bananas, you'd better hope that scientists come around. We might have peels, and those peels might have strips, and those strips may have, stringy bits, yes. A very important resource. So we can start going very deep down this rabbit hole of all of the different ways I'm missing. All the different depths of resource that we can get to. But think about what that URL is going to be for the stringy bits. /banana/banana ID /peel ID /strip ID /stringy bit ID /edit. That's gross. Oh, he rolls off the fingers. So this is a bad idea. Generally more than about 2 levels deep, and it starts becoming an unwieldy URL. Because one of the principles of REST is that it should be a human-readable URL that represents the state of the data. This, I have to break out my Captain Crunch decoder ring to figure out what's going on here and what the right context is for the data that I'm going to be accessing. So it loses its context when you get to a certain level of depth. And the general practice is no more than about 2 levels deep unless you absolutely have to. Because if you're getting more than 2 levels deep, you really need to like stop and ask yourself that question: is this the right context for this data? And should I be doing something shallow? Should I be limiting this with only an accept? Should I be taking some of these and pulling them out so that they're own top-level resources now? You know, there's questions there that you want to ask when you start getting to this point of nesting, because it does get a little bit gross. Any questions about this so far? Calgary, how are you guys doing? With all apologies to Faye. How are you folks doing? How are all of you in lovely Cowtown this morning? Oh yeah, I do. I have 4 resources, 3 ends. Okay. Cool, they're good. Moo. The moo was theirs, not mine. So I can't do, okay, so can I do a shallow true on each line? No, I can't, because I'm also passing the block to it. And so the shallow true is related to the parent. Wait, actually, hold on. Let's try. When in doubt, go crazy. Well, that worked. So let's see what we've got here. We've got watermelons. We've got seeds. We had those before. There's the watermelons routes. All right. So now we have strips and stringy bits. We have stringy bits by themselves in a shallow nesting. That makes sense. We have peels and strips. Okay. So peels and strips have the shallow relationship. And then we have bananas and peels. And then peels by themselves and banana by themselves. What we don't have is that fully nested bananas, peels, strips, stringy bits. We've lost that now. Because shallow true takes the parent, turns it into a top-level resource, and the nested one is the nested with only index, new, and create. No. Well, okay. Let me just say this. It's not so much that that wasn't my intent. It's that I had no idea what was going to happen, and it was like, hey, what's this button do? Theoretically, it should have taken. So let's actually. Nope, that wasn't what I wanted to do. Let's take off 2 of these. And see what we get there. That's closer to what I expected to have happen. You know, bananas, banana ID, peels, peel ID, strip, strip ID, stringy bits, and the shallow nesting there is that the stringy bits can now be accessed independently. And then these are all completely and totally nested as they would be, because I don't have shallow true on those anymore. The thing is, if I needed to do this, it doesn't do me any good to nest them at that point if I'm doing shallow true, because now I've lost that nesting context. The whole reason I would do nesting is to get that context. But with the previous one, when I had shallow true on all of them, there was no point where I saw that those stringy bits were related to that strip, which was related to that peel, which came from that banana. That was gone. So this still kind of preserves that a bit. Yeah, it does. And the problem is now I just have, you know, big, ugly, long URLs like this that still exist. So I just have to ask myself, what is the right context for keeping track of this? This isn't the best example, but it demonstrates how long the URLs can get pretty quickly. Questions? Okay, what time is it? It's 9:37. Cool. Let's go ahead and take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about namespacing, route helpers, and a few other things. Perfect timing. Cool. So, for the break, we went through the routing, nested resources, setting up a context for accessing our data, which was kind of the key piece there of how those routes were getting built. So there's other types of context that we might have for accessing our data. So I made the example before the break of maybe creating a resource, but you want to restrict the delete functionality, so that normal people couldn't delete those resources. Now, if you wanted to restrict that based on who owned the resource, like user IDs and access control and things like that, that's business logic that you would have to go and build in to your controller. But there's going to be plenty of times in an application where you're going to want to be able to access the same data as your regular users, but you may want to access it in a different context. For example, admin. So while, if you think about, let's pick something, Etsy as an example. There's the regular context for how I could go to Etsy and look and see who's made what out of, pallets and mason jars and leftover thread, and see what is up, posted up on the site, and that's my context as the regular user. But there's also the person running those Etsy stores who goes and looks at those same items, but in a completely different context. They're looking at those items, the ones that they've posted in their store, from the context of, I need to administer these items, I need to be able to edit them, I need to be able to update them, delete them, take those steps with them. And then beyond that, there's the people who actually work at Etsy who also need to be able to administer the users and the stores and the items in those stores at that next level. There has to be a way to access that same data, but in different contexts. Now, one way to do that would be to go into your controllers, and if the person is an admin, set up a whole bunch of instance variables. If the person is a store owner, set up a whole different set of instance variables. If the person's a regular user, set up a different set of instance variables. And then you go into your views, and you have these big, huge nested if blocks in your ERB or your SLIM or whatever template language you're using. These big if-else blocks. If they're an admin, show this markup. If they're a store owner, show this markup. If they're a guest or a user, show different blocks of markup. You'd have to define this great big giant ERB file to be able to handle all of those different contexts. Well, that would suck a lot. There would be a lot of copying and pasting. There would be a lot of wet code. And even if you tried to dry that out inside that ERB file, you're just making it now harder to maintain. So going back to the rule I said before the break, in Rails, anytime you're doing something and it seems like it's hard, you're probably doing it the wrong way. And so Rails gives us a way to be able to manage this type of context. And it's called a namespace. So I'm going to get rid of our nested bananas here. And I'm going to say namespace admin. And I'm just going to put watermelons in here for now. So slightly different configuration keyword here, but it's namespace. And when I do this, we can see that I have the watermelons and seeds just like I had before, the watermelons I had before, but now I have this very different set of routes. It is a separate set of RESTful routes, the same CRUD routes, for my watermelons, but now very clearly the path has /admin on the front. Different context. The other thing that's worth pointing out is if we look over here on the right-hand side to the actions column, the controller actions column, it's going to the admin /watermelons controller. This is just going to the watermelons controller. Different controller. which means I can put different business logic in that controller. I will also get a different set of view files for this context. So same models, namespace 100% of the time, same models. The data doesn't change. The context for that data changes. So now if I hit this app with a request/admin/watermelons, the Rails router is going to send it to a different controller. So for example, let's say we're talking about /watermelons in the index route. For the regular one, the public one, that one might be, instead of just @watermelons equals watermelon.all, that might be @watermelons equals watermelon.where active true. Maybe I have some inactive watermelons that I'm not showing. Maybe they're not fully grown yet. So that would be the index query for that action. Whereas for admin, watermelon.all, I'm going to see all the watermelons in the admin context. It might end up being the same query in both places, but that's not wet code because it's a different context for accessing the data. So the other thing is, in an admin context, because I have that separate controller, I can do a before each on that controller and check to see if my user is an admin and redirect them away from that controller entirely if they're not an admin. So I can take care of that before any of those actions ever get run. So I can lock down the entire controller with one line of code, effectively. So now I have a different context for this data, which is great. And you'll see this a lot. In fact, one of the most popular ways you'll see this start to see a pattern here, and whatever watermelons is in French. You see this in routes all the time. /en/something/fr/something. Canada Post does this, for example. And this is a perfect case of a namespace. Same data, but the view files are definitely going to be different. There might be different regulatory things or tax things or whatever it might be that we might do in the controller because it's the different language context, but this is how we would do that different access. Same data, different context. And anything that we would do with like nested resources, plural resources, we can do that inside the namespace just fine. So I can come in here, for example, and I can have my seeds, shallow true. And when I run this, gross. Yep, here we go. Ian, there's the shallow true in the English context with the watermelons and the seeds. So, yeah, so it's very flexible. Onlys and accepts still work with namespaces. All the things that you might want still work. And we have this flexibility. You'll also see this, another use case I've seen is where you have like free versus paid, like a freemium style SaaS product or a game or something like that. There's the free version and then there's the regular version. They might do a context for that. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, the Ruby would not change language. Oh, that's a good question. Okay. So the question basically is, are there programming languages in other languages? Yes. Chinese, there is a programming language written specifically in Chinese. That is, if you work for the government of China, it's mandated that you have to use it. And it starts with, the English version of it starts with a B, and I forget what it is. But the kind of the lingua franca of programming has become English because so much of computer science got advanced in the U.S. Basically from 1950 to about 1980. We were just ahead of the curve in terms of that. There's also a programming language in Russian, but it's not very well used even in Russia. But most programming languages are written in English. And even if you don't speak a word of English and you live in Japan and you are writing, JavaScript, you're writing the same JavaScript we are. There was an interesting port of jQuery done that translated jQuery method names to Spanish. So instead of having like .each, you would have .cada. So things like that have been done, but all it was doing was just making an alias for that, for that method name. So people have done that to ease people's introduction, but most programming is done in English. Yeah, it's just the view files would be in a different language. Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, the whole digital nomad, remote work kind of thing, that's a 100% reality. The company that I consult with, I'm their tech advisor, we have a 100% distributed team. We have people in Amsterdam, we have people in California, we have people in Toronto, we have people in Whistler, like all over the place. Yeah. Yeah, no worries. Cool. So we've got nested resources, we've got namespace resources. There's one more type that I want to talk about. And that's a singular resource. So in this particular case, I have done resource profile. And for now, I'm just going to take these out for brevity. So here we go. Here are the profile routes. And I declared this as a singular resource. We've got new, edit, show, update, destroy, and create. We don't have index. And what else do you notice is missing from these paths? Starts with an I and rhymes with ID. Anyone? Bueller? Okay, yeah. These have no IDs in them. And this is the one quirk with a singular resource, because a singular resource is designed to be related to a single instance of a resource in your database. And it's your job as the developer to acquire the data that's necessary to fulfill this resource request. /account /profile is kind of the most common case that you'll see of this. Because the thing is, if you are logged into an application and you go to mysupercoolapp.com /account, what do you expect to see? Your account. So that's your user profile. The same, let's say you're user 100. If you went to mysupercoolapp.com /user /100, that's your account. But /profile is theoretically, or /account, whatever, is theoretically going to show you that same thing. Now what's interesting is it says that it's going to a profiles controller over here, which may not be exactly right. So here's an interesting bit of configuration that we get to do. We can tell it which controller to use. And then, there we go. It's going to the user controller now. And the user controller doesn't care. Really where it's coming from. Where it is going to matter, though, is if you're expecting an ID in the params. That's where you will have a slight difference. So if you're going to direct something like this kind of link, a singular resource, to your user's controller, and you're always loading the ID from params ID, this is going to break. So if the route is /profile, you may want to pull it from current user instead. By the way, there is a request object in Rails that you can use. It's available in every single controller. And that request object has the path in it that was requested. So you can always tell what path got them to that particular action. Oh, there's lots of stuff in the request. Yeah, think about the request object that you get in Express. That's the full list of everything that is related to that request. Rails builds a very, very similar object. Yeah. Yes. No, you can use it here. What you can't use is params ID. Yeah. So in the case where params ID doesn't exist, you may want to look at current user ID. If the route that they went to was /profile or /account or whatever you named it. Right. Yeah. Cool. So that's most of the routing stuff. Out of curiosity, did Chrome go over the prefix column with you guys yesterday? I see blank stares and drool. No. Okay. Don't worry, you weren't the one drooling. Mostly. Okay. So, I've ignored the prefix column up to this point. You'll notice that the prefix column has something in it for all of the GET requests. And what the prefix column does is it tells you the name of a method that Rails has created for you. In fact, the name of 2 methods that Rails has created for you. These are called the path helper methods. And there's one that is _path and one that is _URL. And the prefix for that full method name comes from this column. So watermelons _path is going to return the string /watermelons. Watermelons _URL is going to return the string http:// localhost 3000/watermelons. Now the reason you would want _path is if you are building a link to in your app to link to another part, if you're doing a redirect somewhere in your application, that's all the times you would want to have the _path. _URL you're going to want if you're sending a JSON request out or JSON response out like to an API call, and you want to be able to put an absolute link back to that resource or back to an image or back to something else. Also, if you're sending out, I don't know, an email and confirmation of purchasing a product from an e-commerce store, hypothetically speaking, crazy I know, you would want to put the _URL in that template because then somebody getting that in their email can click on it and it will send them back to the application. So these helper methods are built for you automatically by Rails when you configure routes, and GET routes automatically get them. And the reason it's okay that GET routes automatically get them is because if you look at it, the path for GET and POST on index and create is exactly the same. The path is the same. So if you need to post to a particular place, in a form, you can use the watermelon _seeds _path as the action for that form. In fact, with form 4s and things like that, it does it for you automatically. Rails just knows. It's magic. And similarly, like seed/ID, so the seed path. If you need an ID in the seed path, for example, in any of the path helpers, so seed path @seed. So if I pass, an instance of a resource to it, it will grab the ID field from that. I can also do this, and that will link to /seed/12. I can also do this and pass a hash to it. Anything I pass that has the key, either a property or a key of ID on it, it will grab that and use that as the ID in the URL. The path helpers are quite smart. In fact, the path helpers even just allow you to do this. I can just link to a seed, and it automatically knows to link to /seed/ whatever the ID is of that instance. That's a whole mechanism that's part of the view helpers, linked to how it works, and it's able to do that because these magic methods exist, and they're built for you automatically as part of the routing. Well, okay, so the question is, when you're defining a route, is there a best practice on knowing which verb to use? That's understanding the purpose of the HTTP verbs. These are built for me automatically. Yeah. No. So yeah, the standard practice in Rails is you do link to, and the where you're linking it to, the text that you want in there, and then you pass method delete. And typically you also have the confirm, are you sure? And if we think about that for just a moment in terms of the view and the route helpers, what that actually builds is well, actually no. What it's doing is this, and the something here is linking to kind of a magic thing. Data method equals delete. It's linking into a magic bit of Rails, and this might actually be, you may actually have it as an href, and then it would go, it might even just go to there. I forget what the actual markup is that it creates when you do it as a link to. But yeah, it puts a data attribute of method delete on it. And it also, depending on the text that you put in there, it'll do data confirm equals are you sure? And that's all that shows up in the markup. And have you guys gone through how the manifest for the CSS works? Yeah? So yeah, that one that's up at the top that looks like this, that's where the magic is for that. That's actually, I mean, effectively what it's got on it. If this has adder, actually, if this data method equals delete, then it's doing an AJAX request and sets the HTTP verb to be delete so that it hits that route correctly. That's also why that works without the page refresh. But yeah, literally it's just jQuery that's looking for the click action on an A and checking to see if there's a method delete on there, or if there's a actually what it does is looks for if there's a data method attribute on it at all, and then changes its behavior accordingly, because it might do different things, since there's 19 different HTTP verbs. So yeah, that's kind of the magic behind how that works. But as far as knowing which one's the best one to use when you're setting up your routes, that's why we spent time making sure you knew your HTTP verbs. Yeah. Yeah. For something like this is 100% the best way. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and that's the convention piece of Rails. Cool. So last thing I wanted to go through today is this. Because understanding this full piece from end to end 100% will make you a better Rails dev. So request comes in and is routed to the port. You know, because we know broken up into packets, flies across the internet, goes to space and back, whatever it has to do, and eventually it's going to get to the physical machine on which your code is running. You know, it may just be going from your browser to your hard drive, but you know, eventually it will get to the physical machine where the code is running. It will go across the network card, whether it's wireless or you're plugged in, and then the operating system is going to say, oh, that's on port 3000. Maybe there's a web server software like Apache or Nginx that's going to send it there, but something that is running in the operating system is going to know that this request goes to the port for your Rails app. Let's just say 3000. The first piece that's going to get it is called action dispatch. And that's the Rails router. And the Rails router is going to do a few things. It's going to build the request object. It's going to set up the session for the request. It's going to handle the cookies. It's also going to handle params. This is all going to be handled by the Rails router. And then the first piece of Rails magic that most people misunderstand how it works is the next thing that the Rails router does, which is, well, I'll just put it up here, creates a new instance of the appropriate controller class. So if we have, you know, /users/12, it's going to, you know, @controller equals userscontroller.new. And it's going to pass a number of things into that constructor, into the initialize method for that. It's going to give us params. It's going to give us session. It's going to give us the request object. Like all of that gets passed in so that we have access to it. And then, now that we have this instance of a controller, it's going to run the appropriate action on the instance of the controller. So when it, you know, if /users/12 is going to users show, it's going to run @controller.show. And @controller.show is then going to run its code for looking up, you know, user.find params ID. And that may be all the code that's in that method. So this is the other part of the Rails magic, and most people don't ever question how this works. They're just like, hey, cool, it works. I don't have to worry about it. How does Rails get the views to work? Any ideas? Yeah, there's a little gnome in a mining cart. Yeah, he wears a floppy hat, sings songs. Yeah. Well, the file gets created. How does the controller know to load that view? Right, but when I run @controller.show, will load @user equals user.find, you know, params ID, then that method stops. How do I get that view? Nope. We already, that's the user.find params ID. It has a, there is a file that exists, yes. That's my story and I'm sticking to it, damn it. So here's the part that is the magic of Rails. Swallow, then breathe. Pro tip. I'm not doing mouse to mouth. So this is the magic here. The view and the layout get turned into methods on the instance of the controller. That is also why the instance variable that we create in the action method has scope in the view. Because instance variables have scope in all methods on the instance. They're global to that instance of the object. So if we create methods on the controller instance for rendering the layout and for rendering the view, then those instance variables now have scope. So what happens is we run the method. So after we've run the appropriate action method, we run the method for the layout, passing the method for the view as a block. This is why we wanted you to learn about passing blocks to methods. Because in the layout, you have that magic keyword yield. So that means when the layout is building itself and evaluating any ERB that's in there, when it gets to yield, it's going to go and run that block, which is the layout that sticks into that part, or sorry, the view that sticks into that part of the layout. And it's run in the context of that instance, so all the instance variables have scope. The return value is the rendered resource added as body of response and returned to client. Now, to Ben's point, the way that it is able to go and find that view and find that layout in order to turn them into methods is because of how they are named. That's why the naming conventions in Rails are so important that you follow them. When the show method gets hit, when the router knows that the show method is the one that's going to be run for that particular resource, then it knows that it has to go to app views resource show.html.erb, or sorry, yeah, app views resource show.html.erb in order to get that file. And unless you specify a different layout, it's going to go to app views layouts application.html.erb. So the naming convention does 100% matter, but it's actually creating methods, just magic, like adding methods to the instance once it's created for the layout and the view. And it then passes the view to the layout as a block, and that's why yield works the way it does. That's why we see yield in our layout files. So hopefully that clarifies the smoke in the crystal ball just a little bit of how things work. It's why we create instance variables in our controller methods, so that the other method that we run for the view will have scope. It's a combination of two things. One probably is your machine. The second is that you're running Rails in development mode. So the asset pipeline, like those manifest files, in development mode, all the JavaScript files and all the CSS files that you have listed there go in as individual script and individual link tags. So if you're experiencing slowness on initial page loads, it's because there's all those HTTP requests that have to be done. When you're in production mode, each one, the application.js and application.css compile down to a single file. So that's much faster. The other thing that's going on, and you may want to make sure this is turned on, is something called turbolinks. Turbolinks is an innovation of Rails. I won't even put finger quoting marks around it because it is actually kind of cool. But turbolinks was the bane of jQuery developers for a long time. What Rails does, because it knows that generally everything is using the same layout, if you click on a link on Rails and it's going to go to a page that uses the same layout as what you have up there, all it's going to do is perform an AJAX request using jQuery.load to load in specifically the view that's needed to replace. So it doesn't have to reload the whole page. It doesn't have to rerun the asset pipeline. It doesn't have to do any of that stuff. All it has to do is just run that view and return that HTML. So that actually makes page loads between pages in your Rails app much, much faster. If you're still experiencing slowness there, turbo links could be turned off, or your machine is just slow, stop torrenting. Those would be my two best recommendations. Honest question, when was the last time you rebooted your laptop? Yeah, may want to do that. I reboot mine every 2 weeks whether I want to or not, just so I can make sure there's nothing like hanging around. If it was if you were working on a Linux machine, you could go years without needing a reboot. There are Linux servers that have literally been up for like 13 years. Well, you're on Vagrant, but you're using a Mac, right? No? Oh. Then, yeah, you may want to see what else is running on your box. If you haven't ever used the command line tool top. Okay. Yeah. Well, Rails is automatically slower than JavaScript. Like Node is faster than Rails by almost a magnitude of 10. Mm-hmm. Caching. Caching is one of the biggest. So the question there is, what are things that other companies, bigger companies that use Rails do to improve the performance of Rails? The first one is caching. If you have page requests, like let's say your index page, where the data is not likely to change very often, and you don't want to have to go through that whole cycle of router to controller, controller to model, model to view, view back to controller, blah, blah, blah. If you don't want to have to go through that cycle, you just cache a static copy of your index page. Benji knows all about memcache. And yeah, you just cache a copy of that, and then it just loads basically from memory, because that copy is sitting in memory, and the app doesn't even have to get triggered, and it's almost nearly instant to get a response back. You can also take the results of frequently done queries. Let's say, for example, you are Billboard, and people are hitting the top 100 all the time. You don't want to have to go and recompute that top 100 every time somebody hits that page, so you would cache the results of that query, and so then all that would have to happen is your page would grab that data out of memory for what the top 100 is and put that into the page. No, I'm meaning putting it into memory on the server side. Yeah, caching in this case is putting it into memory on the server side. And there's a ton of gems and tools and different services you can use for it. There's as many ways to cache as there are to mess up any other part of your code. And in fact, the old joke that keeps coming up is the two hardest things in programming are naming things, caching things, and off-by-one errors. And it's the reason caching things comes up is because how do you then go to your how do you decide when the stuff that's in your cache is stale and needs to be updated? And then, what's your process for updating that cache? Like that's the hard part of caching, but that's what senior devs are for. We're supposedly good at those things. Supposedly. Everybody, it's something you're always looking at. It's something you're always trying to improve the process on. So, yeah, those two things. Then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to look at actually like optimizing your code. All the helper methods that you're running, all the loops that you're running on the back end. Do you need all of them? Can they be sped up? Can you use different methods for them? If you're running really big, expensive queries, can you break that up into smaller queries? Do you need, is there a way to rewrite that query to make it go faster? Can you cache part of it and use that in the new query? Like, lots of stuff like that that you would do to try and speed up the page load process. For example, when I worked at Metro Lyrics, and this was a while ago, like 2005 to 2008, or no, well, roughly. Um, the requirement we had at that point is that there was no query that ever got run that should take more than a tenth of a second. If we were taking basically more than 100 milliseconds to run a query, it was too slow. And even then, if we started pushing up into the 85 and above milliseconds, we got told to make it faster. Whatever we had to do to make it faster, make it faster. And that was just a rule because page performance was so critical. You know, and if you have a page that's got 20 queries on it, well, crap, you got to fix that somehow. Because if each one of those takes a tenth of a second, that's 2 seconds just for your queries. That's not time to render the HTML or CSS or to evaluate the JavaScript. That's not even the HTTP transport time. That's 2 seconds just for your queries. So you look at things like that when you're trying to speed up Rails or speed up any framework. It's not just Rails. But then there's also some things you can do with Rails that are pretty neat. It has some pre-caching stuff in it. So it can look at like what's the most common, like the happy path through the application. And so if you've clicked on the index page and most people, I don't know, let's say you're on a bootcamp website like, I don't know, lighthouselabs.ca, hypothetically. And most people would like go to the home page and then maybe they go to the programs page or maybe they go to apply next or something. We hope they go to apply next. Rails would in the background pre-cache that page, like go ahead and do an AJAX request for it in the browser, so that when you click on that, boom, it just pops up. So you can pre-cache. I don't know what they've done with that in Rails 5. I haven't looked at it since then, but Rails 4 used to let you pre-cache. Yeah. It's something that Rails had the ability to do by itself, but you can always decide to do that on your own. I mean, you know, that's just looking at analytics and figuring out how you would do that in the background. Yeah. It would look identical between Rails and any other platform: PHP, Java, Go, Python. It's just Rails had some of its jQuery UJS magic would do that for you. Basically, the first page would load with an instruction to cache the second page. Yeah. Cool. Other questions about Rails and routing and anything really about Rails? Now's kind of your time to ask any questions about Rails that are bugging you. Other than, why? Rails honestly is awesome. The truth is, like, when it comes to CRUD apps, like, you know, if you're just doing your basic bread actions, it's hard to beat Rails. You know, the scaffolding ability, the beauty of Active Record as an ORM query engine, those kinds of things. The conventions for pluralization, the cookie handling, session handling, params handling, like all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of really, really great reasons to use Rails. The challenge becomes if you are the type of coder who likes to be very much in control of every single line of code, Rails starts to feel uncomfortable. Half the room looks at Benji. But yeah, if you're the type of is it still a popular framework in the wild? Is Mackenzie's question. Yes, it's not as popular as it was a few years ago, but especially in the startup realm, Rails is incredibly popular because it is easy to get something scaffolded and set up quite quickly, and especially now that Rails 5 has the API mode, a lot of people use Rails on the back end so that they get Active Record. And then they'll use something like React or Vue or something else on the front end. And connecting, there's a million blog posts on connecting those two. Yep.
Sounds of it I've missed in the last week, but a means of like the equivalent of console logging for Rails, like to actually see information in
Yep.
various
So the question there is about the equivalent of doing a console.log in Rails, so that you can see in the terminal some debug information. I'm going to give you three answers, and each one is equally valid. There's still pry or bybug that you can use. Bybug works a little bit better with Rails. Yeah, where you would stick like a binding.pry in, where you want the app to pause, and then you've got a REPL, like an IRB style REPL, that you can step and next and forward and back and those kinds of things, and be able to walk through your code, be able to output any variable, run any query at that point. And that's if you need to pause the execution to test how something is working. There's also Rails C. So at any point you can just run Rails C and you can test any query. You can technically create a new instance of a controller and run a method if you really need to, and see what comes back from it. And again, it's just an IRB style REPL, but it has all your dependencies for that Rails app loaded in. Last but not least, you can always just use puts. Like, that's the equivalent of our console.log. Maybe you want to use pp for pretty print, so that, if you're printing out like a big hash or an object, an array of objects or something like that, like, you might want to use pp instead. But I know, I said it. We're all 12, I get it. I'm 11. So, yeah, you might want to use pretty print for printing out raw data, but puts, always works. And you can always do that. You just have to be, like, if you've got the debugger turned on or logging turned on to go to standard out, because that's what it does in development mode. Typically what I would do is I would do puts, and I would like put a couple carriage return, like \n, a couple new lines before and after, so that as my scroll is going, I would see what I was looking for there. You can also just write yourself a helper method that automatically like gives you a big ugly like ASCII output and shows you what you're looking for. And there's nothing stopping you from writing that helper method for yourself. Call it like debug, and then pass it whatever data you need, and it will just get printed out in that format that you've defined. Anytime you're doing something manually a couple different times, automate it. But those are the three answers I'd give you. Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, you can take advantage of the logger itself. Thank you, Sebastian. I forgot about that one. So logger.debug, and as it's logging to the terminal, it will just output whatever data or whatever message you want it to output at that point. Also, don't forget that in the worst case scenario where your app errors out and you get that ugly red screen, down at the bottom is Rails C. So right there in the browser, you can run Ruby code and test and see what's going on, and see if values were what you expected them to be. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's actually now 5 different ways to approach doing that. The other thing with Rails debugging, like I said, that's why I outlined the RCMV, is when you're trying to figure out where something is going wrong, eliminate those one at a time. Is it a routing problem? Is it a controller problem? Is it a model problem? Is it a view problem? And then once you can kind of eliminate where the problem exists, it becomes easier to target what you need to do in something like a Rails C, or where you need to logger.debug or binding.pry or something like that. Other questions? Oh, Calgary went dark. There we go. All good? Cool. Thanks, guys.